Good morning, grace and peace to you from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ. Welcome to another Bible in 90 Days weekly overview. We are moving into our fourth week of readings, which is wonderfully exciting. I hope you are enjoying your readings as the history that the Bible tells unfolds. We'll have a lot more history to cover in this coming week as we read through mostly the books of 2 Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. That will be the topic of discussion underway today. The first thing I'd like to do is give you a brief overview of the major historical events that take place between the rise of King David at the beginning of 2 Samuel through the end of 2 Kings and the conquest of Babylon and the beginnings of the exile. These major events were important in shaping the theological history of the people of Israel, and much of what we will read in the books this week correspond to these particular events. So I want to begin with giving you a brief overview of those events. King David comes to power in about the year 1000 BC when Saul is killed in battle. And he reigns for 40 years until about the year 960, at which case his son Solomon comes to power and inherits the united kingdom of Israel and Judah that David led. Solomon cedes power in about 922, and it's at that point that the two kingdoms split into the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And hereafter there are two kings, one in Jerusalem and the other in the northern kingdom of Israel. In the year 722, the Assyrian Empire conquers the kingdom of Israel in the north. Their leader was a guy named Tiglath-Pileser III, pretty wild name. The Bible just calls him Pul. I would have gone with TP3 myself, but I'm not the Bible, so there you go. The Bible calls him Pul. But he was a vicious and ruthless leader who conquered the kingdom of Israel, and the Assyrian Empire continued to spread. In 701, they reached the gates of Jerusalem when King Hezekiah is on the throne there. And Jerusalem is able to avoid destruction by paying an enormous tribute to Sennacherib, the king of Assyria, at that point. But the fact that Israel survived that moment would be important in their self-understanding moving forward, because it seemed to confirm that indeed a Davidic king would always be on the throne in Jerusalem, just as God's covenant with David in 2 Samuel 7 declared. Empires continue to rise and fall during this time, and the Assyrian Empire falls into decline. The Babylonian Empire simultaneously rises, and there's a brief period in between those two kingdoms that King Josiah comes to the throne in Jerusalem, and he's sort of the last good king. He reigns from about 640 to 609. He enacts a lot of religious reforms and refocuses the worship life on Yahweh alone. He gets rid of a lot of other pagan cultic sites around the area and tries to really reform the worship in Jerusalem. But after he's dies in battle, a number of inept kings come to the throne, and in 597, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, comes to Jerusalem and sends a few folks off into exile. He doesn't destroy Jerusalem, but he puts a puppet king on the throne, Zedekiah, and leaves him there to do his bidding. But when Zedekiah falls out of favor of King Nebuchadnezzar, he returns in fury in 586 and destroys Jerusalem, destroys the temple, and sends the population, the bulk of the population, off into exile in Babylon. So those are the major events that take place in the four and a half centuries from David to Nebuchadnezzar. And that would mark the end of a Davidic king physically being on the throne in Jerusalem. So those are the major events that undergird the storyline that will follow here in 2 Samuel and 1st and 2nd Kings. So let's go back And let's return to the action at the beginning of 2 Samuel. The book begins with the rise of King David. And so David is this idyllic, ideal king. And so much of the Davidic material, of course, then comes from the pro-kingship source. If you remember last week, I talked about the presence of an anti-kingship and a pro-kingship source in these narratives. The anti-kingship source mostly points to the story of Saul, who is a very inept king. But the pro-kingship source holds David up as the ideal king. So much of the material in 2 Kings comes from the pro-kingship source, which is also the earlier source or the older source. David establishes a 40-year dynasty, and he's a very talented person, as you will see in the stories from his life that you'll read. For one thing, he is a talented musician and poet. The vast majority of the Psalms are attributed to David in some way. They're associated with David in some way. And so we'll see a lot more of David in the rest of the Old Testament. David's also a brilliant military strategist. In 2 Samuel 1-7, we will see this, and particularly in 2 Samuel 5, David captures the city of Jabes, renames it Jerusalem, and moves his capital there. And he's very clever about the way in which he conquers Jerusalem. He goes up through the water shafts in Jerusalem in order to invade the city from the inside and avoid having to deal with its walls. These water shafts in Jerusalem will be pivotal in the future when Jerusalem is defending itself against the Assyrians, for example. It allows them to resist much longer because of the presence of water within the city walls. David's also a very astute politician, and we'll see that often as he navigates bringing the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem from its previous cultic site, and thereby moving the center of worship into the city. He establishes multiple high priests to appease everyone based on their various factions. So he's very wise in terms of the way in which he deals with things politically. A huge text, an important text can be found in 2 Samuel 7, where you see the covenant of Davidic kingship. This is another major biblical covenant, the first major one that we've seen since the covenant of Moses back in Exodus. In this chapter, 2 Samuel 7, you'll see the word house repeated 16 times and meaning a variety of different things. It will refer to the king's palace. It will refer to the temple of the Lord. It will refer to the royal dynasty of the king, and also just the private domestic households in the area, and also the household lineage. We talked a lot about last week about the emphasis on lineage, so household can also refer to that. So you'll see the word house a bunch of times in 2 Samuel 7, and this covenant is all about the house of David, especially the Davidic house of David, which will reign forever on the throne in Jerusalem. Now, when God establishes this covenant with David, it is an altogether different kind of house. It's a new kind of covenant. For one thing, it's unconditional. And this is a brand new sort of ideology. Kingships in the ancient Near East were always thought to be conditional. Of course, many of them were undergirded in their legitimacy by the approval of the gods. But in this case, the Davidic kingship is said by God to be unconditional. In other words, not contingent upon the king doing God's will. This was not the case for Saul, the first king. His kingship was very conditional. God says to Saul, basically, obey me and keep my word, keep the throne, but disobey me and you will lose it. So as the story goes forward, we'll see that this idea of unconditional kingship will remain in the south, but after that split, after the reign of Solomon into northern and southern kingdoms, the northern kingdom will be conditional, or seen to be conditional, and the southern kingdom only will fall under this unconditional covenant of kingship that God makes with the Davidic line. There's a long history of the succession of King David that's narrated throughout 2 Samuel 9 through 20 and even into 1 Kings. It all starts with the Bathsheba affair that David falls prey to in 2 Samuel 11. He sins greatly by his treatment of Bathsheba and her late husband Uriah. And from there, things get pretty tough for his family. His son Absalom revolts, and there's a whole sort of, not all-out civil war, but there's a struggle within the Davidic line, and ultimately Solomon, David's son by Bathsheba, becomes the next king and kills his brother Absalom. So once again, we see in these stories that although our culture has changed quite a bit since the time of David, human nature and its selfish inclinations are more or less the same from generation to generation. So as David fades and Solomon rises, we'll begin to see more and more that David becomes the yardstick by which all kings after him will be measured by the biblical authors. He becomes the sort of paradigmatic king in the history of Israel. When Solomon comes to power, after all, David's kingdom is in full bloom. It shows the vast majority of what you would expect a kingship in the ancient Near East to reflect, to hold. So, and of course, again, there's this idea that it is an unconditional kingship that will be in place forever. Solomon represents the establishment of this Davidic line within the covenant, as he is the successor to David, and from his lineage, he shows that indeed this covenant is playing out as God promised. Solomon builds the temple in Jerusalem, and so he gets credit for building the place where God's name would dwell on earth. And as this temple is built, this is the beginnings of the established link between God and the king. We'll see in certain psalms when we get there about the sort of correspondence between the kingship and the cult, or the worship of God. They become closely linked. And so the idea develops, of course, that if you don't want to offend God, then you also shouldn't defend God's king. So Solomon inherits this intact, functioning kingdom, and everything is sort of handed to him on a silver platter, if you will. Everything is in place. Solomon, too, is also associated with certain very positive and glamorous traits. Wisdom is associated with King Solomon. In 1 Kings 3, he asks for wisdom in a dream, and he's granted it by God. There's a famous story of his discerning between two mothers who each claim that a child is theirs, and Solomon wisely works out that dilemma. The Queen of Sheba comes to Jerusalem and marvels at Solomon's wisdom, which lends a great deal of legitimacy to his kingship on an international scale. And in 1 Kings 4, we read that Solomon is a composer of proverbs, and this will certainly persevere in the biblical tradition as the book of Proverbs specifically, but all of the wisdom books in general are often associated with Solomon and his wisdom. Solomon also has an enormous amount of wealth. In 1 Kings 5, we read about the construction of the palace, and then, of course, again, 1 Kings 6 to 9, we read about the construction of the temple. And between these two enormous houses of the king and God, Jerusalem becomes the center of theology in the biblical world. All that you need is right there in Jerusalem. Solomon gives a great speech as well in 1 Kings 8 at the dedication of the temple that lays out a great deal of this theology. Now, this temple in Jerusalem was not a Hebrew invention at all. In fact, the temple in Jerusalem, Solomon's temple as it would come to be known, is an adaptation of a Syro-Phoenician temple. It's designed, in other words, much like a Canaanite temple, which I think in a strange way foreshadows much of the idolatry that the people will continue to struggle with, and ultimately that will be attributed, the exile and the downfall of Israel and Judah ultimately will be attributed to this sort of idolatry. Anyway, the temple had a three-part design. It had the porch as you enter it, the main central room, and then the Holy of Holies. And as you got deeper into the temple, the closer you got to God's presence, to God's name. It served to portray the transcendence of the deity as the approach had to be done in steps. You'll read about all the details, once again, of how long the temple is in terms of its cubits, kind of like the tabernacle that we read about in the wilderness. And there's just plenty of spots in the Bible where very specific measurements are preserved for chapter after chapter. Herod the Great would expand ultimately on the Temple Mount. The temple would be destroyed by Babylon and then rebuilt when Israel returns from exile in Babylon, and then at the time of King Herod, it would be expanded as well and renovated. But it would still be based on that second kingdom, or the second temple, that was built once the folks return from exile. So this would be the place where the temple would be all the way up through the time of Christ. Solomon built the temple by means of forced labor, and it's in the building of the temple that we start to see sort of the harsh, domineering side of King Solomon that will lead to his downfall. He enslaves a number of people to build his temple, and he also started to build up store cities where extra supplies could be kept, cities like Gezer and Megiddo and so on. So we'll see that Solomon is really expanding this empire, as we would expect from any other king that we read about throughout history, and we increasingly begin to see that Solomon is not so much a king operating in the likeness and image of the Lord, but rather in the likeness and image of other human kings. And so as the story of Solomon progresses, we begin to see increasingly negative aspects of this King Solomon. His rise to the throne is marked by a series of murders and banishments. He gets wealthy through the heavy taxation of his people, and he ultimately, through these actions, prompts us to remember back into 1 Samuel 8, where Samuel gives a speech against kingship, warning about the dangers of kingship. So many of the prophet Samuel's words come true in the days of King Solomon. In other words, his greatest fears about the kingship ultimately come to pass. Solomon is also blamed in the Bible for his polytheism, and this happens because of his many wives. So he marries a bunch of foreign wives who bring with them their gods and their religious commitments from their cultures, and so idolatry begins to flourish under King Solomon. So often treaties in the ancient Near East were sealed through political marriages, and so that's what Solomon is doing when he marries all these foreign wives. He's making treaties with other nations and trying to expand his power. Another important text to look back on as we read through Solomon's life is Deuteronomy 17. In Deuteronomy 17, which I'm sure you all remember right off the top of your heads, but in Deuteronomy 17 we read about the limits of the king's power. And there's three specific things that Moses requires of the future kings that he declares that Israel will ask for when they enter the promised land. And those three things are that the kings are not to have many horses. That is, they're not to have a huge military. They're not to have many wives, which will also reflect that military expansion through treaties. And they're also not to have much wealth, because their wealth will lead their hearts astray. And by the end of Solomon's life, those are the very things that he's done, and his heart has indeed been led astray, just as Moses warned in Deuteronomy, and as Samuel warned in 1 Samuel. By the end of his reign, Solomon's country hates him, his country splits into civil war, and the kingdom of Israel breaks into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. Now, the monarchy at this time had created an enormous burden on the people, which was part of why this split took place. The massive building projects that Solomon instituted were exhausting. He enlisted an enormous army and required lavish support of the temple and its worship. So there was just a lot going on under Solomon. He was expanding too much too fast. His greed and thirst for power and influence ultimately got the best of him, and so he turns away from God. Also, the geography, by the way, in this region was another obstacle, because the rolling hills of Egypt are not ideal for maintaining a unified kingdom. When you bring 12 tribes together into one kingdom, as David was able to do, it's not always easy to keep them together because they're operating in different environments, and so they have different commitments and priorities. There's various stratification schemas in the different areas, or class divisions. There's a lot more Canaanites in certain tribes, and the influence the Canaanites bring can be more or less troubling to some of the other tribes. And so there's all sorts of dynamics at play that account for this splitting of the northern and southern kingdom. But ultimately, as far as the scripture writers are concerned, Solomon's moral failures are the most direct cause of this split between the northern and southern kingdom. So after King Solomon, Judah is a kingdom in the south that continues through King Rehoboam, and in the north, Israel establishes Jeroboam I as its first king. Jeroboam, we first meet in the Solomon narratives when he flees to Egypt, and he returns after Solomon's death and takes over in the northern kingdom. Some of Jeroboam's career accomplishments are that he separates the worship, or the cult, from Jerusalem, and when he moves the cultic center to the north for the northern kingdom, this will ultimately be seen as the sin of the house of Jeroboam. This never gets disassociated with him, and it's the beginning of the ongoing idolatry in the northern kingdom that the biblical authors will point to. By the way, it's important to note that after the split of the northern and southern kingdoms after Solomon, we're getting the perspective of writers who live in the south after the kingdom in the north has fallen. So they are reflecting on all of the things that went wrong in the northern kingdom and why, in the end, God allowed them to be conquered. And so they're not going to attribute much of anything good to the kings in the north, and they're going to highlight their sins of idolatry because that's the primary meaning that they derive from the fate that Assyria lends to the kingdom of Israel in conquering it. So it's not coincidental that the rise of kingship in Israel corresponds with the rise of the prophetic office in Israel as well. It's a sort of checks and balance system. As the kings rise and grow in power, the prophets rise as the mouthpiece for God to try to keep these kings in check. So we have people like Solomon, people like Samuel, who first appeared in 1 Samuel, and then a number of other prophets we will encounter throughout the course of 1st and 2nd Kings, most notably folks like Elijah and Elisha, who try to hold kings accountable. As the story unfolds, as I mentioned before in the timeline, we'll see that the northern kingdom falls in 722 to the Assyrians, and that this persistent idolatry in the north will be the cause of that. But ultimately the south too will fall in 586 at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and the people will be shipped off into exile. And that sort of ends this period of independence, first for Israel in the north until it's conquered, and then also for Judah in the south. And there's a sudden shift, an enormous shift that we'll explore much more in future weeks that emerges after this exile happens. So that's an overview of the readings for this coming week. I hope I didn't spoil too many of the stories for you, but I wanted you to have a sense of where this narrative is going and what the central concerns of the writers are. I hope that you enjoy these readings as you read about this very dysfunctional history of these kingdoms as they struggle to live the life that the Lord has commanded them to live in all of those laws that we've read about in previous weeks. So may God bless your reading this week. As always, let me know if you have any questions, and we'll see you again next week as we continue to make our way through the Bible in 90 days.